Chapter 10: Apocalypticism, Prophecy, Dreaming of the End of the World, and the Singularity Archetype. And make sure you look at the screen. This is a stenciled graffiti I found in Underpass in Boulder, Colorado several years ago. There it is. Historically, it is chiefly in times of physical, political, economic, and spiritual distress that men's eyes turn with anxious hope to the future, and when anticipations, utopias, and apocalyptic visions multiply. Carl Jung said that. As I discussed in the introduction, prophecy is the most unreliable of human enterprises. Dieting, falling in love, betting on the stock market, crypto, or horses, even lottery tickets, all have far higher success rates than prophecy. But of all types of prophecy, there is one that, from the perspective of linear time, has been wrong 100% of the time. It is also the most popular type of prophecy, end-time apocalypticism. Apocalypticism is a nearly universal, addictive habit of the human psyche. Narratives about the end of the world have existed since the beginning of recorded history. The tale of Noah and the flood, the Norse myth of Ragnarok, the Hindu myths of recurring worldly annihilation and regeneration, and Zoroastrian, Babylonian, Sumerian, Buddhist, Islamic, Greek, Roman, African, Mayan, and Native American all describe the destruction and transformation of the world, the struggle between the powers of good and evil, and the divinely determined destiny of humanity and the cosmos. As historian of religion, Mircea Eliade notes, the myth of the end of the world is of universal occurrence. I got to do a pronunciation check on his name. I'm always struggling with it. It is already to be found among primitive people still at a Paleolithic stage of culture, and it recurs in the great historic civilizations, Babylonian, Indian, Mexican, and Greco-Roman. My friend Rob Brezhny, in his inventive book, Pronoia is the Antidote to Paranoia, catalogs the millennia-long parade. As far back as 2800 BC, an unknown prophet wrote on an Assyrian clay tablet, "Our earth is degenerate in these later days. There are signs that the world is speedily coming to an end." In the 7th century BC, many Romans believed Rome would suffer a cataclysm in 634 BC. Around 300 BC, Hindus were convinced they lived in an unfortunate time known as the Kali Yuga, the lowest point in the great cosmic cycle. In 426 AD, the Christian writer Augustine warned that this evil world was in its last days. According to the Lotharingian panic mongers who lived more than 1,000 years ago, human life on Earth would end on March 25th, 970. Astrologers in 16th century London calculated that the city would be destroyed by a great flood on February 1st, 1524. American minister William Miller proclaimed the planet's purification by fire would occur in 1844. Anglican minister Michael Baxter assured his followers that the Battle of Armageddon would take place in 1868. The Jehovah's Witnesses anticipated the end of days in 1910, then 1914, then 1918, then 1925. That was from Rob Brezhny. Our age may have more of these doomsayers per capita than previous eras, although the proportion of religious extremists among them has declined as more scientists, journalists, and storytellers have taken up the singing of humanity's predicted swan song. One of the reasons that prophecy is so unreliable relates to the perpetual confusion in the human psyche between the inner and outer world. Inner and outer do converge through synchronicity and through many causative mechanisms such as self-fulfilling prophecies, but the boundary between them is genuinely blurred, which makes the confusion understandable. The most classic confusion of inner and outer is interpersonal projection. We project some disowned part of ourselves onto an individual or group. For example, a man may project the disowned feminine aspect of his soul onto a beautiful woman walking by him on the street. Gazing at her, he feels the resonance of eternal recurrence. I've known her from other lifetimes. We are meant to be together. His perception is correct, except that it focuses out when it needs to reflect within. The disowned aspect of his soul is meant for him, and it has been with him from time immemorial. He confuses the intrapsychic with the interpersonal, and if he acts on that confusion, the result could range from obnoxious to criminal. Most interpersonal violence, as well as genocide and other forms of collective violence, occur in a state of shadow projection, where disowned and dreaded parts of oneself or of the collective are projected onto a despised other, another race, or nation state. Anything with a strong emotional charge in the psyche, especially if the charge is uncomfortable, will be projected outside. One of the strongest charges in most psyches is anxiety about death. A person suppressing awareness of mortality may project that repressed fear onto the world. I can feel it. This is all temporary. This world is going to end. I am living in the end times. Again, the perception is correct, except for the confusion of inner and outer. Every mortal is always living in a personal end time. Death is always imminent, and even if any of the many possible causes of premature death are avoided, the years left are usually a 1 or 2 digit figure. The uncomfortable feeling of perilous temporal fragility must go somewhere, and an end-of-world prophecy is like a lightning rod for this intensely uncomfortable inner charge. Like a fractal or a hologram, the life cycle of the individual recapitulates the life cycle of the species. Yes, I realize ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, hasn't held up biologically, but I'm speaking more generally. An individual has a certain limited lifespan before they cross the event horizon of death, and a species also has a limited lifespan before it becomes extinct. The average lifespan of a mammalian species is 1,000,000 years. And of course, we're doing everything possible to lower the average. Of course, Homo sapiens is working hard to lower that average for many species. Just added that parenthetical note. Because of the parallelism, it's easy for someone to confuse the imminence of personal death with collective eschaton. This confusion is also well motivated, as it seems to displace much of the individual anxiety about death, which is usually faced alone, onto a we're all in it together general event with strong elements of high drama and excitement. Instead of feeling powerless about the inevitability of one's own death, the prophet feels empowered by their sense of having been privileged with secret knowledge withheld from the common person. Also, the ego is very concerned about its place in the social hierarchy and is appalled by the idea that it could cease to exist while others continue to live. However, if everyone checks out at once, then death involves no such social humiliation. Even better, if there's some sort of rapture, where the ego is part of an elect that becomes immortal while others of the sort the ego doesn't like are annihilated or left behind to deal with the Antichrist and Armageddon, then personal anxiety about death gets channeled into an all-satisfying scenario. Okay, I just improved the prior sentence a bit. However, if everyone checks out at once, then death involves no such social humiliation where rivals may take away their lovers, possession, wealth, status, and reputation. Even better, if there is some sort of rapture where the ego is part of an elect that becomes immortal, while others of the sort the ego doesn't like are annihilated or left behind to deal with the Antichrist and Armageddon, then personal anxiety about death gets channeled into an all-satisfying scenario. As Joseph M. Fessler writes, Even St. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest philosopher of the Middle Ages, suggested that part of the joy of being in heaven was gazing down into the dark abyss of hell and enjoying the eternal torment of the damned. And I just italicized left behind, which comes before to deal with the Antichrist and Armageddon, and added a footnote because some people may not be aware of the Left Behind reference. Left Behind is a multimedia franchise of apocalyptic fiction written from a feverish evangelical end times perspective by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. And all that happened from 1995 to 2007. Okay. For these powerful psychological reasons, prophecies of the end of the world usually seem to be conveniently scheduled to occur before the end of the prophet's expected lifespan, allowing the eschaton to upstage anxiety about personal death. Many years after I formed this hypothesis, I heard of an episode that gave this theory a little anecdotal support. Elizabeth Steen, a woman some considered clairvoyant, predicted a massive earthquake would happen in the Bay Area on August 14th, 1969. In copycat fashion, other psychics began to predict a quake on the same day. This was such a high-profile prophecy that there were several New York Times articles about it. Elizabeth was sincere in her prediction, and at great expense she relocated her family from the Bay Area to Spokane, Washington. On the predicted date, there was no earthquake, but Elizabeth was not there to see the failed prophecy. She died a couple of weeks earlier at the age of 29 or 30 of a usually non-fatal medical condition. It should not be surprising that personal death and eschaton are conflated, displaced, and otherwise mixed up with each other, since both are faces of the singularity archetype. Depending on how the conflation works itself out, apocalypticism is one of the most significant ways the singularity archetype can pathologize in the individual and collective psyche. But sometimes, even in the darkness of apocalypticism, like the white yang dot in the black yin portion of the familiar yin-yang symbol, transcendent aspects of the singularity archetype shine through. This is particularly true when apocalyptic visions occur spontaneously rather than through cultural indoctrination. This light, hidden within visions of apocalypse, seems to be part of the etymology of the word apocalypse. The word derives from the Greek apocalyptine. Sorry, I don't speak ancient Greek. Let me put a pronunciation check in there. To uncover, reveal, from apo, un, and kalputin, to cover. The most successful prophets. Apocalyptic prophecy has the highest failure rate of what is already the most unreliable of human enterprises. Especially bad at prophecy are self-appointed prophets, especially if fundamentalist. And that should really be self-appointed fundamentalist prophets. Hopefully you're not getting too exasperated with my real-time editing, but I changed that to especially bad at prophecy or fundamentalist. Or fundamentalists, I should just say. Didn't need the other words. New Age prophets, psychics, and seers are just as bad. One group, however, has had some spectacular successes: fiction writers. It's probably no coincidence that science fiction writers have also given us our most penetrating visions of the singularity archetype. Fiction writers have enormous advantages over religionists. Their art gives them access to the collective unconscious, but they're not obliged to perceive visions through the rigidities of established traditions. Also, since they're usually not invested in ego identities like psychic, seer, and prophet, they're less likely to take themselves too seriously or feel obliged to produce supposedly visionary work when uninspired. The fact that they usually don't know they're doing prophecy can make them clearer channels by reducing ego involvement. For all these reasons, science fiction writers are great prophets of the singularity archetype. In his perceptive essay, An Arrow Through Time, cognitive scientist, philosopher, and journalist Stephen A. Schwartz discusses the reliability of various forms of future gazing. He singles out fiction writers for some stunning hits. For example, he points out Edgar Allan Poe's 1883 novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, pseudonym of Nantucket. In the novel, Poe describes the shipwrecks of the brig Grampus, including an account of 3 sailors and a cabin boy lost at sea in a small boat. The desperate sailors kill and eat the cabin boy, whose name is Richard Parker. In 1978, the Times of London ran a contest on coincidence that was judged by Arthur Kessler. The winning entry was a true story of an uncannily similar shipwreck. 3 sailors and a cabin boy escape in a small boat, and the boy is killed and eaten. The boy's name? Richard Parker. When the real sailors who had been caught were tried for their crime, Poe's book was discussed at their trial. Schwartz also digs up a remarkable rejected manuscript Jules Verne wrote in 1863, Paris in the 20th Century. Well, it's not published, I'll put it in quotes. In correspondence discovered with the manuscript, Verne's publisher felt it was too unbelievable and would be a commercial disaster. The manuscript vanished into a forgotten safe for over a century. According to Schwartz, Verne put it in a safe where it remained forgotten for more than a century. It was rediscovered in the 1990s by an heir who found the safe in a barn on a Verne family country estate that had come down to him. When a locksmith opened the safe, the manuscript and the correspondence were found. Paris in the 20th Century was finally published in 1994. Okay, so I guess it was published. The protagonist is a 16-year-old boy who has graduated from a major in literature and the classics, but finds that this course of study is useless in the futuristic world of 1960, where only business and technology are valued. Among the more specific predictions, Verne describes a geometric modern centerpiece built for the Louvre. In 1989, I.M. Pei's glass and steel pyramid was unveiled in exactly that spot, now one of Paris's most iconic landmarks. And by the way, it was at first reviled by snobby French cultural critics, as was the Eiffel Tower, by many Parisians until it gradually caught on, as has I.M. Pei's glass pyramid. Schwartz summarizes some of the other extraordinarily accurate predictions Verne makes in this novel. Verne describes 20th century Paris as having a skyline dominated by a large metalwork tower. There it is, the Eiffel Tower. The streets are paved. Technology and business dominate Parisian life, and women are Americanized, as is the French language, which is filled with adapted American words. The horses that jammed and polluted Parisian streets in 1863 are gone, replaced by vehicles of metal. Average people work for big corporations, uninvented in their modern sense at the time he was writing. They sit in offices and work at computers and send paperwork to one another by facsimile machines. Yes, he even uses the word. Of course, now fax machines are obsolete, but this was 1960 that he was predicting it would happen. So we probably didn't have those in 1960 just yet, but I haven't looked that up. The most famous case of literary prediction is Futility, an 1898 novella by Morgan Robertson, published 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic in April 1912. Futility features an ocean liner named Titan, which sinks in the North Atlantic after striking an iceberg. The Titan was the largest craft afloat, seen as the greatest work of men and considered unsinkable. Due to the hubris of its designers, it carries an extremely deficient number of lifeboats, resulting in a tragic loss of life when it sinks on an April night. Schwartz provides a table listing some of the main similarities between the novel and actual incident. Fatal sailing date: Titanic, April. Titan, April. Flag, English for both. Length in feet: 800 for Titanic. Um, no, 800 for Titan, 882 for Titanic. Number of propellers: 3 for both. Top speed in knots: 25 for Titan, 24 for Titanic. Watertight bulkheads: 19 for Titan, 15 for Titanic. Passenger capacity: 3,000 for both. Passengers aboard: 2,000 for Titan, 2,200 for Titanic. Number of lifeboats: 20 for Titan, 24 for Titanic. Cause of sinking: struck iceberg for both. Side of vessel breach: starboard for both. The 19th century's other most famous science fiction writer, H.G. Wells, had, like his French colleague Jules Verne, some amazing predictive successes. As Schwartz notes, in his various novels, Wells predicted gas warfare and tanks, aerial bombardment, and nuclear war, as well as industrial robots. But if you ask scientists what impresses them most about Wells' predictions, they say it is the infrared lasers in War of the Worlds. And by the way, today's what? Monday. Just yesterday was a 60 Minutes came out talking about laser weapons to take down drones and how that would revolutionize what's going on in Iran right now. First published in 1898, the same year as Futility, the story centers on the invasion of Earth by aliens and contains this description of the aliens' principal weapons system. The intense heat they project in a parallel beam against any object they choose by means of a polished parabolic mirror of unknown composition, much as the parabolic mirror of a lighthouse projects a beam of light. However it is done, it is certain that a beam of heat is the essence of the matter. And this is what, 60 Minutes from yesterday, which would be March 15th of 2026. They showed you scenes of these new laser devices melting, the Iranian drones and stuff like that. However it is done, it is certain that a beam of heat is the essence of the matter, heat and invisible instead of visible light. Whatever is combustible flashes into flame at its touch. Lead runs like water, it softens iron, cracks and melts glass, and when it falls upon water, incontinently that explodes into steam. So now, lasers are visible, but it's still pretty damn close. Schwartz also cites the case of James Russ Jr., who, writing as Harrison James, published Black Abductor in 1972. As Schwartz puts it, writing as Harrison James, Russ tells the story of the kidnap of a young college student named Patricia. So for younger listeners who don't know that in the 1970s, an outfit of terrorists called the Symbionese Liberation Army abducted the heir of the Hearst fortune, Patricia Hearst, Patty Hearst, by an angry black man, and the Symbionese Liberation Army was led by an angry black man leading a terrorist gang. So close were the similarities that when Patricia Hearst was kidnapped in 1974, Russ received a visit from the FBI, and the book, as with Poe's Pym, came up in the trial. Grove Fresh later reissued the book with transcriptions of Patricia Hearst's testimony and explicitly focused on the similarities between what it called fact before fiction, or fiction before fact. Schwartz concludes his essay with an instance of fiction writers and movie directors being employed to predict the future by the U.S. military. After 9/11 occurred, Variety reported that U.S. military intelligence experts invited a group of screenwriters and directors who specialized in thrillers to, as one source told the magazine, focus on the short-term threats. Included in the group were Stephen D. Souza of Die Hard, David Engelbach of MacGyver, and directors Joseph Zito, Delta Force One, Missing in Action, The Abduction, and Spike Jonze. The virtual meeting took place by Cyberlink at the University of Southern California's Institute for Creative Technologies, formed in 1999 at the U.S. military's initiative to develop virtual training programs for servicemen. The group talked about possible terrorist targets in the United States and how best to confront terrorist threats in the wake of the September 11th terror attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And that reminds me that right after January 6th, the invasion of the Capitol, I wrote something about Trump and made some predictions. And sometime shortly after that was published, my webmaster texted me that suddenly there was a surge of traffic to that particular article, that something like 85 people had all signed on at once, and every one of them was in a place where there's a large military base. He was able to to code the traffic and whatever. And so his theory was that it was military intelligence were looking at what I had written. And of course I accept that without question because it's flattering. All right. Positive encounters with the singularity archetype tend to occur for people dealing with apocalyptic circumstances in their waking lives. These encounters will often occur during the dream time. For example, on August 24th, 1945, 3 weeks after surviving the bombing of Hiroshima, a Japanese man had a dream recorded by Michael Ortez Hill in Dreaming of the End of the World, Apocalypse as a Rite of Passage, a dream already discussed in the Logos Beheld chapter, which is chapter 3. So I'm just going to put in chapter 3. In which an eye sitting in the palm of a girl's hand leaps into the sky and returns on a vast hovering eyeball. What is especially fascinating is that the eye, the embodiment of the Logos Beheld aspect of the singularity archetype, becomes a spontaneously occurring symbol of the Godhead and of collective consciousness, arising here not from mystical practice, but from the psyche's raw encounter with the actual apocalypse. Jung believed that dreams were mostly compensatory, making up for defects and one-sidedness in the waking attitude in life. After witnessing an actual man-made apocalypse, the feminine appears as a girl holding an eye in her hand. Hill points out some other dreams and statements that reveal the convergence of apocalypse and singularity as life-affirming metamorphosis. For example, William Lawrence called the rumblings of the Trinity explosion the first cry of the newborn world. In his memoirs, Curtis LeMay, who coordinated the World War II air combat over Japan, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, wrote of the nuclear baby clinging as a fierce child against its mother's belly. LeMay was also the strongest advocate for all-out nuclear war with Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, he's sort of hilariously caricatured by Rod Steiger. Even more extraordinary is the following dream. There is a distinct crater left by the bomb, and it is filled with water. We walk around the crater with a kind of awe. There is an odd sort of beauty attached to it. A mother is baptizing or drowning her baby in the water of the crater. I am aware of the intense radioactivity that must be in the area and can't resolve whether she is baptizing the infant or killing it. There is a deep sense of mystery to this. Then, in the dream, a voice ordered, "Make a child." I refused and yelled back, I can't. I'm 46. There are no facilities left to test for birth defects. I've had cancer. I've had 2 children. The world is destroyed. I cannot, will not make a child. The voice remained kind but adamant. New life, it demanded. New life. White Raven Rising. Dream of Apocalypse and Transcendence. One morning in the summer of 2004, I talked to a small group about their dreams. We were at a wilderness gathering, a rainbow gathering, in the Modoc National Forest in northeastern California. It was a high desert, perhaps 9,000 feet in elevation, and uncommonly beautiful. It was my first morning at this gathering, and I remember the air was scented by high desert plants, especially sage. As the conversation was breaking up, a man in his early 40s, we'll call him Kyle, who had been listening attentively, asked if he could speak to me in private about a dream that would not be appropriate to share with the group. I followed him to a secluded spot where we sat surrounded by sagebrush. Kyle told me that he had been part of a U.S. military minesweeping team in Nicaragua in the 1980s. After coming out of the service, his life was in a terrible state and he was suicidal. He had experienced some horrible things during his time in Nicaragua and was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. We can just make that PTSD. We don't know what that means. One experience in particular haunted both his waking life and his dreams. A guerrilla group planted mines in a schoolyard. So this is in his real life experience. A couple of small boys had wandered into the yard and were killed by a mine. Kyle was called in to deal with the situation. The boys had been dead for 2 days in the tropics, and their bodies were in about as horrifying a condition as they could be. Kyle removed the mines and felt obliged to rescue the bodies so that the family of the boys could bury them. He vomited several times before he could summon his will to go out there and wrap what was left of the boys in a couple of blankets. During the depth of his suicidal phase after returning from Nicaragua, Kyle had a series of 6 nearly identical nightmares. In the nightmares, he would be at the schoolyard and he would hear one of the boys calling to him for help. In each case, he would get to the boy and find him in a terrible state, a state where no one could possibly be calling for help, and he would hear the death rattle, the characteristic sound of a body's final exhalation, something he had also witnessed during his time in Nicaragua. Each time, Kyle would awaken from the nightmare in a cold sweat. He felt the nightmares were purposefully driving him to suicide. The 7th dream begins exactly like the other 6. He gets to the dismembered boy and hears the death rattle, but this time a white raven is spiraling down from the sky. The raven lands on the boy's head, and the boy, suddenly intact, gets up and begins dancing. The white raven also does a strange dance. Kyle showed me with his arms how the raven held its wings out and danced like a shaman would. After the dance, the white raven looks at Kyle and says, "I think you ought to see this." The white raven flies up in a spiraling manner, and of course that's Singularity Archetype symbolism, and as it spirals above him, Kyle feels himself being pulled up as if the spiraling were a tornado, much like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz's tornado we discussed earlier. Kyle finds himself elevated above the earth and has an experience of indescribable mystical transcendence. He is no longer time-bound and finds himself experiencing eternity and a direct and ineffable sense of a harmonious meaning and reason for everything. The state he describes seems to be a spontaneous experience of what Hindus and Buddhists call samadhi. The experience leaves him permanently transformed. The suicidal despair is gone, and he is finally able to set his life on a positive course. Kyle had one of the most direct encounters possible with the Singularity Archetype. In the depths of the dark night of the soul, he experienced a true apocalypse and unveiling at the end of time. The end of time does not have to mean the end of the world, history, or the species. In this case, it means the end of linear time, which on the scale of an individual life could be a transcendent samadhi type experience, a shattering dark night of the soul, or the event horizon of death. The Singularity archetype pulls Kyle into its transcendent spiral at the end of time, where linear time gives way to eternity. He emerges on the other side of the event horizon, permanently transformed. Okay, I just added a sentence to do the callback to The Wizard of Oz, discussed in earlier chapters. He is lifted from his depressed, gray-scaled existence into a transcendent plane, much as Dorothy is lifted by a tornado from black and white Kansas into Technicolor Oz. Christian theologians borrowed the Greek term, theologians borrowed the Greek term metanoia to describe such a profound spiritual metamorphosis. The dreaming unconscious seems not to have been pushing him to suicide, but was creating an ordeal poison-like spiritual initiation. This tracks with Michael Grosso's idea that Homo sapiens may need a collective NDE to metamorphose. It also corresponds to what was discussed in chapter that the psyche is conservative, I don't know the chapter number for that, and needs existential shocks to transform. Dreams about apocalypse that contain the transcendent qualities of the Singularity archetype do not, of course, require apocalyptic waking circumstances. In chapter 2, I gave the example of a young man who dreamt of what seemed the end of the world. The sky is turning very dark. Was that chapter 2? Maybe that's chapter 1, actually. Put in some question marks there. The sky is turning very dark. Underground tremors occur and escalate to where the earth seems to be shaking itself to pieces. There is fire and lightning, and it seems to be the end of the world. Then everything calms down. Sunlight breaks through the dark clouds and illuminates a large white eagle which comes spiraling down from above. In its talons, it holds a golden egg with a glowing aura. Carefully, it deposits this egg in a nest at the top of a great tree. And now here you really must look at the screen and see a painting by my friend Brenda. I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. But you can see the, well, just take a look at the painting. It's quite awesome. I met the artist, Brenda Faramani, at a Jeremy Taylor dream seminar in 2007 where we discussed the dream that inspired this striking painting. Here's her description of her dream. And the painting is called Fallen to Fear, acrylic. I am in my bed at night. I hear coyotes in the distance. There is a window at the foot of the bed and a light in the sky shining in. I sense there's something out there. I move toward the window, and as I do, I am sucked out. I begin falling into endless darkness. I am falling down into the deep darkness. I feel like screaming, but then I remind myself I am dreaming. At this point, I become lucid. I can see and feel everything slow, and I stop falling. I ask, "What is for me here?" I demand. "Show me, show me." Then I begin to move upward. I see the stars as I am traveling up to the heavens. Then huge metal discs with alien writing start moving up around me. I yell once more, "Show me." I even say this out loud in waking reality, and I wake myself up. The descent into apocalyptic darkness causes the artist, a seeker of visions, to demand that it be a true apocalypse, an unveiling. Her "show me" demand is rewarded with the Logos beheld revelation. And it's kind of suggestive of, this is an aside, of course, of Jung's attitude in the Red Book, where he isn't like overwhelmed by meeting divine figures, the devil, God, whoever, but is like, show me what you really mean, and so forth. It's okay to be demanding toward elements that appear from the unconscious, and to really be an interlocutor with them, not merely an odd recipient or passive, dumbfounded observer or something. The metal disc could have many levels of meaning, but the alien writing suggests that language itself has been made visible and concrete. In 2009, shortly after completing a major revision of this book, I received two remarkable dreams from a friend, Genevieve, a software engineer in her mid-20s. Both dreams contained precise singularity archetype motifs she could not have assembled consciously. A beam of life that updated her genetics while rendering her mute. The logos beheld, arriving as the old verbal mode shuts down. A communal experience shared by strangers in a coffee shop. Collective metamorphosis theme. Hybridized religious iconography mutating under cosmic heat. Static mythologies return to the alchemical kiln. And generational stuckness. Older groups increasingly reluctant to witness what was happening in the sky, like the movie Don't Look Up. The dreams read like a compressed transmission from the collective unconscious. The dreams read like a compressed transmission from the collective unconscious, updating the archetype for a generation of cultural and spiritual hybrids with no single tradition to anchor them. A full account of Genevieve's dreams and my extended interpretation is available as a supplemental document at zaporacle.com, and this is the same page. I'll provide the link later. I guess it's there if you look at the screen. It was 2,500 words. I just didn't have space for it here, but it was in the first edition, the whole thing. Apocalypse and Metamorphosis in the Bible. Okay. Any fundamentalists out there, prepare to be triggered. And from then on, there will be nothing corruptible. Enoch 69:27. Looking at the singularity archetype through religious prophecy is another version of looking through a glass darkly. Just added a trigger warning for fundamentalists up there. Looking at the singularity archetype through religious prophecy is another version of looking through a glass darkly. At best, it is like looking through thick, semi-transparent stained glass windows. The jigsaw puzzle-like pattern, we don't need semi-transparent. The jigsaw puzzle-like pattern of lead solder forms a fixed template defining and segmenting your vision. Oxides of cobalt, copper, and gold added long ago to molten glass predetermine the colors you will see. But to be fair, stained glass windows are meant to be looked at with awe from a distance. They are certainly not made for looking through. I find it more useful to view the singularity archetype through the eyes of modern individuals, as this book primarily does. But the stained glass came first, and we need to see what it refracts. Apocalyptic visions in the Bible erupt right out of the collective unconscious. As Norman Cohn points out in Cosmos, Chaos, and the World to Come, the ancient roots of apocalyptic faith, to a much greater extent than the prophets, an apocalypticist commonly received his revelations in visual form, whether as dreams or as ecstatic visions. Often the events that were revealed to him were disguised in symbols and allegories. Apocalyptic visions, Cohn points out, came through intimate visual contact, a radiant angel rather than the invisible voice of God. Quote from Cohn: unlike the prophets, the apocalypticists were not spoken to by God, but through the intermediary of an angel who may help explain the meaning of the visions and guarantee their truth. Daniel, the biblical Daniel, in other words, I found myself on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris. I looked up and saw a man clothed in linen with a belt of gold from Ophir around his waist. His body gleamed like topaz, his face shone like lightning, his eyes flamed like torches, his arms and feet sparkled like a disk of bronze, and when he spoke his voice sounded like the voice of a multitude. I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while those who were near me did not see it. I heard the sound of his words, and when I did so, I fell prone to the ground in a trance. Okay, I'm trying to find a specific Kripal phrase. Hang on. Okay, I took a time out there to add something new here. Daniel's description reads like a biblical version of someone encountering one of the X-Men or Dr. Manhattan. Kripal, professor of comparative religion, says religion is just yesterday's science fiction. And but that's my memory of how he described it to me at Esalen. So I'm going to put in a note there to get him to verify his actual phrasing. Certainly the book of Revelation reads like cinematic, if dated, dystopian sci-fi. Chapter 12 of Daniel, retroactively post-dated 4 centuries to the mythic figure of Daniel, contains the Hebrew Bible's first prophecy of metamorphosis into glorified bodies. Chapter 12, the last in the book, closes with a remarkable prophecy. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will wake, some to everlasting life and some to the reproach of eternal abhorrence. This passage has no parallel in the Hebrew Bible. It marks a decisive break within the traditional Israelite notion of earth. Another quote, the fate that awaited the wise leaders was more wonderful still. It is indicated in chapter 12. The wise leaders shall shine like the bright vault of heaven, and those who have guided the people in the true path shall be like stars forever and ever. Admittedly, some scholars have interpreted these images as mere metaphors, signifying no more than the glory of these men's achievements will remain forevermore. Yet, there is abundant evidence from the following 3 centuries in Jewish and Christian sources that exceptionally holy individuals expected at the end to receive garments of glory that would make them resplendent and fiery. The apocalypticist is surely foretelling that he and his fellows will exist forever as superhuman beings, angel-like, star-like. In our era, I just wrote this, such garments of glory would be the underwear on the outside plus shimmering cape of a superhero. The Book of Jubilees foresees a day when aging will be transcended, and the days will begin to grow many and increase amongst the children of men, till their days draw nigh to 9,000 years, and to a greater numbers of years than before was the number of days. And there will be no old man, nor one who is full of days, for all will be as children and youths. Sometimes Jesus seems to suggest just that. In the kingdom, he says, men and women will be like angels in heaven and will not marry. Elsewhere, he is reported as saying that in the kingdom, the righteous will shine like the sun. Mark 12:25, Matthew 13:43. The Book of Revelation and the Singularity Archetype. And Jesus is very down on marriage and families. Read the New Testament. It's right there. He tells him to leave your wife, leave your family, and join him. And if you want to, I did a post where I was inviting some friends to Burning Man, and I said, if you want to follow a childless Jew out into the desert, come with me to my camp at Burning Man. A key motivating force for apocalypticists, and there's a footnote here, an apocalypticist is a person obsessed with apocalypse. An apocalypticist is a writer of apocalyptic prophecies. Apocalypticists are therefore a subset of apocalypticists with a C. Of the biblical era and of today, a key motivating force for apocalypticists of the biblical era and of today is intense desperation about the conditions of their day-to-day lives. The most memorable scene for me from Nikos Kazantzakis' visionary novel, I've got to put a pronunciation check in there, because I'm going to be performing the audio book in the next few months. The most memorable scene for me in Nico's visionary novel, The Last Temptation of Christ, involves a scream tearing from a rooftop in Jesus' sleeping village. Not one voice, but the whole village dreaming and crying out together, God of Israel, Adonai, how long? Biblical archaeologists and scholars agree that the author of the book of Revelation, known as John of Patmos, was writing under Roman persecution, exiled to the barren penal island of Patmos under the Emperor Domitian. According to Tertullian, John had already survived an attempt to execute him by plunging him into boiling oil in Rome, a tradition impossible to verify but consistent with what we know of Domitian's methods. Whether or not that specific ordeal occurred, John was writing as a man whose body was forfeit to imperial power, cut off from his community on a desolate rock in the Aegean. This matters psychologically. My theory is that much apocalypticism, ancient and modern, is personal fear of death projected outward onto a cosmic screen. I should put in a once again. A man who has faced execution, who lives under a regime that can kill him at any moment, and who is gifted with visionary intensity, will naturally metabolize that terror into mythic form. The world must end because I might end. The persecutors, let me italicize that. The persecutors must be annihilated because annihilation is what I fear. If John's personal fear of death was fully activated, and there's every reason to believe it was, what followed was entirely predictable, a fever dream of destruction in which his enemies are consumed and the righteous, his community himself, are vindicated and glorified. As sympathetic as I can feel toward a fellow Jewish author haunted by visions and driven to share them with the world, I also have to admit to a significant personal bias against Revelation more than any other book in the Bible. My unfriendly attitude is shared by a number of early church fathers who campaigned vociferously, but alas unsuccessfully, at the Council of Nicaea, I assume, to keep Revelation out of the canon. Thomas Jefferson called the book of Revelation merely the rantings of a maniac. Forgot to put it on pause. Sorry about that. Michael Grosso, whose Millennium Myth is otherwise a sympathetic and penetrating treatment of the apocalyptic imagination, doesn't spare Revelation's pathological dimension. He observes that it exudes the language of the will to power, that, quote, there is scarcely a trace of love, forgiveness, or humility, such as one associates with Jesus of the Gospels. The book's moral universe, Grosso notes, is drawn in terms that are absolutely dualistic, rigidly incapable of compromise. And John's vindictive rage, he observes, reigns supreme to the last verses of his text, including the remarkable threat, if anyone adds anything to them, God will add to him every plague mentioned in the book. Grosso's conclusion is unambiguous. Deal with that punctuation issue. Grosso's conclusion is unambiguous. It's hard to think of a better word than sadistic to describe some of the sentiments expressed in chapter 9 of the book of Revelation. The bias is more about what's been done with Revelation and its effects than about the long-dead author, a traumatized visionary doing what traumatized visionaries do. To compensate for my bias, I'll discuss in detail the interpretation of a fellow Jungian, Edward Edinger, who finds in Revelation what I cannot, a transcendent psychological map of transformation. Okay, I just had Claude fact-check me on what Thomas Jefferson said about Revelation and about opposition by early church fathers to keep it out of the biblical canon. Both were confirmed and more details were added. So my unfriendly attitude is shared by a number of early church fathers. Eusebius, Cyril of Jerusalem, Chrysostom among them, who campaigned vociferously, but alas unsuccessfully, to keep Revelation out of the canon. It was excluded at the Council of Laodicea in 360, only to be restored at Carthage in 397. That will need a pronunciation check. Okay. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to General Alexander Smith, January 17, 1825. It is between 50 and 60 years since I read it, the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, in other words, and I then considered it merely the ravings of a maniac, no more worthy nor capable of explanation than the incoherences of our own nightly dreams. Michael Grosso, whose Millennium Myth is otherwise a sympathetic and penetrating treatment of the apocalyptic imagination, doesn't spare Revelation's pathological dimension. Okay, I guess I read a lot of that. So let me go forward now. The bias is more about what's been done with Revelation and its effects than about the long-dead author, a traumatized visionary doing what traumatized visionaries do. To compensate for my bias, I'll discuss in detail the interpretation of a fellow Jungian, Edward Edinger, who finds in Revelation what I cannot, a transcendent psychological map of transformation. I guess I read that as well. Besides being highly toxic and addictive, the book of Revelation is also not very original. If it were a movie, we would say it was too derivative, too retro, too many borrowed elements from much older films in the same genre. As Kirsch puts it, many of the end-of-the-world auguries that appear in the Bible, the signs and tribulations of the end, the struggle of God and his Messiah against evil, and the figure of Satan and his demons, can be traced all the way back to Zoroastrian writings of Persia, the earliest of which may be several hundred years older than any of the Jewish or Christian texts. Revelation takes many of these appropriated elements and remixes them again. From my point of view, Revelation is like a Led Zeppelin song heard after several strong bong hits. It means whatever you want it to. Who is the whore of Babylon? Whatever country you don't like. Who is the beast? Whatever famous person creeps you out at the moment. The game has continued for 2,000 years, even though biblical scholars will tell you the whore of Babylon almost certainly meant Rome, and 666 in the beast almost certainly meant Nero. And what about wars and rumors of war? I hear contemporary apocalypticists mention that sign of the end times constantly. I hear contemporary apocalypticists mention that sign of the end times constantly, and I've got to sift through where you're supposed to use apocalypticist versus apocalypticist. Did these people sleep through high school history class? In the several thousand years before Revelation was written and the 2 millennia since, When were there not wars and rumors of wars? And yet contemporary evangelicals keep pulling out wars and rumors of wars like the most hired of magicians' rabbits from a hat, as though it clearly targets this time. But it's no more identifying a historical moment than saying during a time when there were rumors of love affairs and betrayals. Essentially, Revelation, with its lurid, over-the-top, surreal imagery, is mass psychosis bait. It's like a Rorschach ink blot printed on a page of blotter acid. Unbalanced psyches are drawn to it like a magnet. David Koresh of Branch Davidian Waco infamy wrote in a wedding invitation, "I have 7 eyes and 7 horns. My name is the Word of God, and I ride on a white horse. I am here on earth to give you the 7th angel's message. I have ascended from the east with the seal of the living God. My name is Cyrus, and I am here to destroy Babylon, Brault, and King inside the cult." I need to remember that to put in the next response to a wedding invitation myself. Koresh was engaged in writing a commentary on the 7 seals when ATF agents invaded the compound, and he even agreed to surrender when he finished with that work. Of all the researchers I've read who've written about the book of Revelation, I feel most in sympathy with Jonathan Kirsch, author of A History of the End of the World, How the Most Controversial Book in the Bible Changed the Course of Western Civilization. Kirsch seems to view Revelation as a kind of over-caffeinated mashup of prophetic texts from the Hebrew Bible. He refers to Revelation as essentially a Jewish document with a light Christian touch-up. I will go much further than Kirsch and call Revelation a highly addictive hallucinogen that produces a fever dream state of mind that can cause you to do harm to yourself and others. If it were up to me, Revelation would be sold packaged like cigarettes and emblazoned with a black box warning label. If you want to see the graphic, look at the screen. Warning: Revelation can be extremely hazardous and even fatal. May cause psychotic ideation leading to suicidal and or homicidal, if not genocidal, consequences. Instead of images of cancerous lungs, I would emblazon the package with graphic images of Jonestown and Heaven's Gate. Revelation pathology is not restricted to disenfranchised crackpots. It reaches into some of the most powerful political centers in the USA. Kirsch points out this tendency. By 1984, for example, the Republican Party deemed it appropriate to invite televangelist James Robinson to give the invocation at the convention where Reagan was renominated, and Robinson deemed it appropriate to deliver a white-hot apocalyptic sermon to the enthusiastic delegates. Quote, "Any teaching of peace prior to Christ's return is heresy," said Robinson. "It's against the word of God. It's Antichrist." In case this seems confined to the Reagan era, the same week I was revising the section of this chapter, the Military Religious Freedom Foundation reported receiving over 200 complaints from U.S. military personnel across every branch of the armed forces. Again, this is in the last few days. Commanders briefing troops on the 2026 U.S.-Israeli strikes against Iran were telling their units that the war was all part of God's divine plan, citing the book of Revelation by name. One combat unit commander informed his non-commissioned officers that President Trump has been anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran to cause Armageddon and mark his return to Earth. He had, according to the complaint, a big grin on his face. The complaints came from more than 50 military installations. The goalposts hadn't moved. The playbook was identical to Robison's 1984 convention sermon, only now it was being delivered not to cheering delegates but to soldiers who might be deployed to die for it. What makes this theologically audacious is that the Hebrew Bible, The very scripture that these apocalypticists claim as their foundation contains explicit prophecies that the coming of the Messiah would bring an end to war. Daniel 9:24 declares that the messianic age would put an end to sin and bring in everlasting righteousness. Isaiah is even more direct. The Messiah's reign would be one in which nations beat their swords into plowshares and shall not learn war anymore. Isaiah 2:4. These are not peripheral verses. They are the central criteria by which Jewish tradition has always evaluated messianic claims, and the primary reason Judaism concluded that Jesus did not fulfill them. Okay, so sorry, I had to do some fact checking there. So I might have forgotten where I left off, but I think it was here. I think I already shared Robeson's sermon and pointed out that that now these kind of words were being delivered by cheering delegates. They were delivered to cheering delegates in 1984 by Robeson, but right now, in March of 2026, are being delivered by military commanders to soldiers who might be deployed to die for it in Iran. What makes this theologically audacious is that the Hebrew Bible, the very scripture these apocalypticists claim as their foundation, contains explicit prophecies that the coming of the Messiah would bring an end to war. Daniel 9:24 declares that the messianic age would put an end to sin and bring in everlasting righteousness. Isaiah is even more direct. The Messiah's reign would be one in which nations beat their swords into plowshares and shall not learn war anymore. That's from Isaiah 2:4. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end. That's Isaiah 9:6-7. This verse directly promises the Messiah will bring eternal peace specifically, not just righteousness. Last time I checked the news, I saw little evidence of our living in an era of eternal peace since the coming of Jesus. These are not peripheral verses. They are the central criteria by which Jewish tradition has always evaluated messianic claims, and the primary reason Judaism concluded that Jesus did not fulfill them. Christianity's theological answer was the innovation of the second coming. Jesus will accomplish it next time. That second coming has been perpetually imminent for 2 millennia, and yet every new generation of apocalypticists discovers with fresh excitement that the signs are finally converging now. Jesus himself stoked that imminence. In all 3 synoptic gospels, he tells his disciples, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And that's from Matthew 16:28, Mark 9:1, and Luke 9:27. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians in the first person plural, "We who are still alive, fully expecting to be present at the parousia himself." That's from 1 Thessalonians 4:15. The earliest Christians were not waiting for something centuries away. They were waiting for something that was supposed to happen before they died. It didn't. These are among the most theologically embarrassing passages in the New Testament, which is why an entire cottage industry of apologetic reinterpretations has grown up around them. But the plain reading is unambiguous. The goalposts have been moving ever since, and every generation of apocalypticists has been absolutely certain that their moment is the one prophecy had in mind all along. No other document in human history can match Revelation for the number of failed end-time predictions it has inspired. Some of these predictions have had violent, tragic consequences, but others have been hilariously idiotic. A former NASA rocket engineer named Edgar um, Whisenant wrote a book entitled 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. Okay, probably not a good credential for an aerospace engineering career. Kirsch points out another case of overconfident revelation-related marketing. One enterprising preacher offered a package tour to Israel that was timed to coincide with the day when faithful Christians would be raptured to heaven. The price of the package was $1,850, including return if necessary. Another quote, "We stay at the Intercontinental Hotel on the Mount of Olives," the brochure announced, "and if this is the year of our Lord's return, as we anticipate, you may even ascend to glory from within a few feet of his ascension." In the mind of someone possessed by fundamentalist belief, contemporary secular humanism, television news flashes, and radio bulletins can all be retro-projected into the Bible. Billy Graham, spiritual advisor to several presidents, as of this writing, he has spent quality time with 12 U.S. presidents. Okay, I better fact check that. That was from 2011. Billy Graham, who met with 13 U.S. presidents, Truman through Trump, and provided spiritual counsel to 12 of them while they were in office, wrote in his book, Approaching Hoofbeats, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. The Bible teaches that peoples and nations have brought this pain upon themselves by humanistic religion and man-made war. Almost every headline, almost every television news flash, almost every radio bulletin proclaims one truth. The rider who brings death is on his way and hell is close behind. And we already know who the rider who brings death will turn out to be. Whoever is currently most convenient for the believer's political fears. A placard that was hung proudly in the office of former Speaker of the House Tom DeLay read, "This could be the day!" Of course, apocalypticism in high office is not limited to the U.S. and Revelation. And now, don't worry, I will not be sparing Judaism for this kind of mockery. Islam also has apocalyptic prophecies. "The hour is coming," goes one verse of the Quran, which describes a stalking beasts and various cosmic cataclysms. The rolling up of the sun, the darkening of the stars, and the movement of the mountains, the splitting of the sky, and the inundation of the seas as signs of the day of resurrection when the tombs are overthrown. This pathology is not the exclusive property of evangelical Christianity. In 12-er Shia Islam, the dominant faith of Iran, the equivalent figure to Billy Graham is Mohammed Ahmadinejad, president of Iran from 2005 to 2013. Except that where Graham confined himself to hellfire rhetoric, Ahmadinejad had a nuclear program and state-sponsored terrorism. The object of his apocalyptic devotion was the hidden imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, believed to have vanished into a well in Samarra, Iraq as a young child in the 9th century, entering a state of divine concealment called occultation until the end times, when he will return to establish peace and justice on earth. Things that are obviously very important to Iran. Ahmadinejad had briefing letters dropped down a well at Jamkaran, a mosque near Qom, regarded as a sacred site of the hidden imam, and kept an empty chair at cabinet meetings in case of the Mahdi's imminent return, and allocated $17 million in state funds to expand the Jamkaran Mosque. He personally oversaw construction of a highway connecting it to Tehran's international airport so that, in his own words, the hidden imam could travel directly from Jamkaran to Tehran's airport without getting stuck in traffic. For Ahmadinejad, demented prophecy intensified a nuclear weapons program, funded Hezbollah, and fueled proxy wars across the Middle East, leaving a body count that dwarfs anything a televangelist ever inspired. Schneerson was the seventh Lubavitcher rabbi, leader of Chabad Lubavitch, and by any measure one of the most influential Jewish leaders of the 20th century. He built, but I should just mention that, people think Hasidim, those are like the real Jews and stuff. That's actually a relatively recent sect, and it was also like a messianic sect. It's not that old. He built a global network of outreach centers, inspired thousands of emissaries to plant themselves in every corner of the world, and spoke with a moral seriousness that commanded respect far beyond his movement. The height of his achievements adds drama to the tragic comedy of his death and failure to resurrect. If it were a movie script, it would be way over the top. As an example of singularity messianic psychosis, however, let's make that a new paragraph. As an example of singularity archetype messianic psychosis, however, it's a bullseye. The only messianic classic element it lacked was a body count, but that would have diminished the comedy. As we used to say when I worked as a staff gemologist and teacher at the GIA, the Gemological Institute of America, in the heart of New York City's 47th Street Diamond District, where at 5 p.m. we'd see Williamsburg-bound buses with a mechitza, a gender curtain, running down the middle so that male and female Hasidim couldn't mingle. Hasidim, but I don't believe him. By the early 1990s, his followers at 770 Eastern Parkway in Crown Heights were regularly chanting in his presence, "Long live our master, our teacher, our rabbi, the King Messiah, forever and ever." A cornerstone ceremony was held in Israel in February 1992 for a house being built for him there, because his arrival was understood to be the coming of the Messiah. A sign at the site read, "The time of your redemption has come." A Chabad rabbi predicted, "I expect Crown Heights will be empty of Jews." Then Schneerson had a massive stroke, lost the use of his right side, and never spoke again. This did not slow anyone down. A children's summer camp composed a song. "Am Yisrael, have no fear. Mosaic will be here the year. We want Mosaic now. We don't want to wait." I need a pronunciation check there. Okay. In January 1994, followers were preparing to anoint him King Messiah, stopped only by a last-minute maneuver to keep the paralyzed mute Rebbe from being wheeled out for the ceremony. His telephone hotline called for fasting, psalm recitation, and charity in multiples of 92 so that he would reach that age and live. He died at 12:30 a.m. on June 12, 1994, at the age of 92. Outside Beth Israel Hospital, men danced and chanted, "Long live the Rebbe, King Messiah, forever and ever," while his body was still warm. Now comes the theological pivot, and it's the pivot that matters for the singularity archetype. Prior to Schneerson's death, mainstream Jewish theology held firm that the Messiah must come from the living. No Jew outside the Jews for Jesus had ever maintained that a person who died in an unredeemed world was the Messiah. But Schneerson was dead, and the devotion was not. So the theology quietly recalibrated. The Messiah would now have to come from the dead. Before his death, an entrepreneurial Hasid had introduced devices called Messiah beepers, pagers clipped to the belts, and set to go off when the Rebbe revealed himself as the Messiah. After his death, the beepers were repurposed. Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn and Israel now wore them, waiting for the signal that Schneerson had risen from the dead. Diminutive electronic shofars, tucked under the black suit jackets and left charging on bedside tables in Crown Heights and Kfar Shabbat, ready to herald the resurrection of a 92-year-old man buried in Queens. 30 years later, huge billboards depicting bearing Schneerson's face and the word mosaic line the Alon Expressway into Tel Aviv and the road from Ben Gurion Airport. Yellow mosaic flags fly over Crown Heights. Mitzvah tanks, Chabad's mobile outreach vehicles, cruise the streets of Manhattan emblazoned with the Rebbe's likeness. Messiah is here. Posters appear on traffic lights and construction scaffolding from Brooklyn to Chinatown. And now here, you should look at your screen. This is one of those posters I photographed in Chinatown in 2022, and you'll see underneath the big headline, Messiah is here, it says, "Long live the Lubavitcher Rebbe, King Messiah forever." So those are still being put up. At 770 Eastern Parkway, followers set up Schneerson's prayer lectern before services and clear a path for the now invisible Rebbe to enter and exit the synagogue, as they did when he was alive. A faction called the Mezhikists declared that Schneerson hadn't died at all. He is, they insist, alive and well in body and spirit in the full sense, and continues to reside at 770 Eastern Parkway. The Hebrew word mamash, meaning really or in fact, was reinterpreted as an acronym. Menachem is the name of the Messiah. A letter published as a paid advertisement in Jewish newspapers, signed by numerous Lubavitcher rabbis, declared it halaically obligatory, a binding requirement of Jewish law for all Jews to profess that Schneerson was the Messiah on the grounds that he was a verified prophet, and the law requires belief in a prophet's words. The Rabbinical Council of America responded with a formal resolution. Because remember, Hasidim is just a relatively small sect. Most Jews in America are Reform, which is what I was brought up in, where there's none of this kind of stuff. But what I really turned against Reform Judaism was in Jewish Sunday school when they said the age of miracles is over. Well, I knew that wasn't true. I had experienced personal paranormal miracles, and it's not in the Bible that there's an expiration date on those. And at lunch at Esalen, Jeffrey Kripal told me that actually comes from Protestantism. So I'm not a Reform Jew either. But I still identify very strongly with being Jewish. My 23andMe came back 100% Ashkenazi. Okay. There is not and has never been a place in Judaism for the belief that the Messiah will begin his messianic mission only to experience death, burial, and resurrection before completing it. They were talking about Schneerson. They were also, without quite meaning to, talking about someone else. Rival Rabbi Elazar Shach, 96 years old and nobody's fool, offered the more efficient verdict. Woe to the Messiah that needs signatures and street advertisements. What Shabbat had produced without noticing was a near perfect recapitulation of the theological structure of early Christianity. The death of the expected one, the disciples' insistence that the death didn't count, the expectation of imminent return, and the ongoing, increasingly creative revision of what imminent means. Judaism had reinvented the resurrection theology. Okay, let's make that Hasidic Judaism. It's obviously not all of Judaism. Had reinvented the resurrection theology it spent 2 millennia rejecting, and the Ol, Schneerson's gravesite in Queens, still receives more mail than most living celebrities, anybody beneath Taylor Swift, certainly. The psychic template doesn't care which tradition it wears. the dying and returning God, the elect who see what others can't, the hour that is always about to strike. They're all the same golden oldie, the singularity archetype pathologizing into messianic psychosis. Zapp prophesizes 2 incoming apocalyptic prophecies. Since it's so easy to mock the disconfirmed prophecies of others, I'm going to go out on the shaky prophecy limb myself and memorialize my predictions in this book. As of this writing, the Apocalypticism brand is slightly depressed and between major cycles. The 1999 Nostradamus King of Terror prophecy fizzled. The Edgar Cayce Ring of Fire and assorted Millennium Shift predictions came and went. Y2K turned out to be a wet cardboard dud. Harold Camping predicted the rapture twice, May 21st, 2011, then October 21st, and unraptured and died in unrapturous 2013. The Mayan 2012 phenomenon, which I wrote about extensively in the years leading up to it, because one of my closest friends is the late John Major Jenkins, so we had all kinds of talks and shared writings and so forth about that. He was not he was the real astro archaeological visionary that added new insights to what that date meant, but was never, contrary to what some people try and say, one of the people like Jose Aguirre's predicting doomsday scenarios. And so 2012 was a particularly egregious example of Western projection onto an indigenous calendar system that predicted nothing of the kind. And you can see something I wrote. There's the URL on the screen. It's also a YouTube called Carnival 2012, a psychological study of the 2012 phenomenon and the 22 classic pitfalls and blind spots of esoteric research. No, the Mayan calendar didn't end in 2012. Like all calendars, it's perpetual. A long count cycle ended. And no, despite the endless ominous talk about Mayan prophecy, exactly 0 ancient Mayan prophecies about 2012 have ever been found. There's just like the Popal view that has general comments on like what cycle shifts mean, but doesn't specifically target 2012. Mostly it was flaky, exploitative people projecting their ancestral apocalypticism onto unsuspecting artifacts of Mesoamerican culture. And Jose Aguirre was the most famous and worst of those. Though there were many people in that rogues gallery, but you can read Carnival 2012 to encounter all of them, some of whom have tried to forget their participation in that. Each disconfirmation temporarily suppresses the fever and somewhat inoculates the collective, but never kills the pathogen. It just waits for the next infectious opportunity. For decades, I've been mocking end-time prophecies' 100% failure rate. One of my central theories of apocalypticism, developed earlier in this chapter, is that it's usually a projection of individual fear of death. The ego is extremely invested in its place in the social hierarchy. Personal death is anathema to that investment as you cash in all your chips, which are then collected by others, some of whom may be rivals. A collective apocalypse is therefore far more desirable because the individual loss is leveled across the collective. Okay, I really covered all this. I think I should just delete this. Well, it does have one good sentence. Maybe I need to subsume that into the earlier reference. And if that end time event is supposed to leave lefties, Jews, and the kind of people a prophet doesn't like left behind to deal with the Antichrist, while fellow evangelicals get raptured away, well, that's the kind of all-satisfying scenario that can give an old male ego a hard-on it hasn't had in years. For now, I'm going to strike that through and think about that. End-time prophecies aren't sexy unless the end date is scheduled to happen before the prophet thinks his personal end time is likely to happen. But we can't say that about Sir Isaac Newton. Based on his obsessive and tortured study of the book of Revelation, Newton came up with the end date of 2060. We don't hear much about this prophecy yet because no one in 2026 wants to wait 34 years for the end of the world. Especially older guys don't like an end date that far out because they know a final heart attack is likely to arrive before the second coming. An end date doesn't light up like a blinking red neon "the end is near" sign unless it has nearness to displace fear of personal death. But if we're still here in 2050, I'll commit to the following prophecy. Expect a rash of movies and documentaries with names like the Newton Code. My second prophecy. The next major resurgence of apocalypticism will be triggered by artificial intelligence, specifically by developments in AI and computational biology that activate Mark of the Beast imagery and related revelation templates. The Singularity archetype will pathologize through the same old script, but this time the technological content will be genuinely new and genuinely frightening. John didn't even anticipate electric light bulbs. But not to worry, you can take his Led Zeppelin album lyrics and apply them to anything. Our earth is degenerate in these later days. There are signs that the world is speedily coming to an end. Bribery and corruption are common. Children no longer obey their parents. Every man wants to write. I don't know where that came from. The end of the world is evidently approaching, commonly attributed to an Assyrian stone tablet circa 2800 BC. We can't be sure who wrote that, but I'll bet it was a cranky older guy. Older generations always diss younger generations. What aging baby boomers say about Gen Z is a retread of what the World War II, aka the greatest generation, said about them. Ever since I was a child, I've heard cranky old guys, unconsciously fearing their own demise, say, "The world is going to hell in a handbasket." And they usually include the young, those who will supplant them, as a prime cause of the general decline. Now that I'm a cranky old guy myself, I feel forced to put on the grim clown suit of aging apocalypticist and admit that the scenarios I'll develop in the AI chapter of this book make end of the world prediction more credible than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just as someone studying the psychology of infatuation is not thereby immunized from being infatuated, I'm open to the possibility that I've succumbed to the very projection I've spent this chapter documenting. Edward Edinger and the Apocalypse Archetype in Revelation. Edward F. Edinger was widely considered the dean of Jungian analysts in the U.S. Although I never met him, in the few degrees of separation characteristic of the Jungian community I was part of in the 80s, I was separated from him by 1 degree. He was the teacher, analyst, and adoring friend and mentor of my analyst and friend for 45 years, Jonathan J. Goldberg. So I just added another sentence there. I was also separated by 1 degree from Jung, especially by Goldberg's uncle and Jung's colleague, German psychiatrist Werner Engel, with whom I had some very interesting dialogues. Edinger had a very profound understanding of the dynamic nature of archetypes, and his book Ego and Archetype is rightly considered a classic. Edinger's final book was Archetype of the Apocalypse, Divine Vengeance, Terrorism, and the End of the World. Edinger died in July of 1998, shortly after approving the manuscript for publication. Of course, what Edinger called the archetype of the apocalypse maps onto what I call the Singularity archetype. I'm struck that when Edinger was writing his last book, both the personal and collective sides of the Singularity archetype were in states of charged imminence. He was both at the edge of his own death and very close to the turn of the millennium when apocalypticism was making one of its periodic resurgences. Edinger was well aware of the topical nature of the subject. In fact, after the Oklahoma City bombing, he wrote a letter to his city's newspaper entitled The Psychology of Terrorism. Edinger concluded, "Zealots are possessed by transpersonal archetypal dynamisms deriving from the collective unconscious, fundamentally a religious phenomenon that derives from the archetypal collective unconscious." Oops. I guess I have that repeated. Delete one of those. Okay. This is why I do beta testing. Edinger decried the unpsychological perplexity with which people responded to the Oklahoma City disaster. From his perspective and mine, it was merely one more of history's endless violent eruptions of archetypal material. Okay, so this is Edinger. And there is hardly a line of print or moment of television dedicated to understanding what had happened. The governor of Oklahoma would say at a memorial service, "We can't understand why it happened." And we get this all the time with mass shooters, like, we can't know, we can't understand. Why can't we? Of course we can. It's just people who don't want to deal with the shadow who say we can never know about such things. Turn on the news and you'll hear endless discussion of war, violence, political struggles, etc., without a moment's consideration of the most salient fact about all of these: they are entirely psychological products. Some will say, "Oh no, it is money that is at the root of everything." But what is money? It is an artifact of the human psyche. I should put it too is an artifact of the human psyche. Okay, Edinger's work on the archetype of the apocalypse is entirely compatible just put Edinger's archetype of the apocalypse is entirely compatible with my work on the singularity archetype. As Edinger writes, this archetype of the, I should say, is almost entirely compatible. As Edinger writes, this archetype of the apocalypse takes on autonomy and tends to direct whatever is of a psychic nature in its vicinity to line up with its own lines of force. Its contents are somewhat arbitrary, since it is in the nature of an archetypal network that it can extend farther and farther, eventually to encompass the whole collective unconscious. Essentially, we are recognizing the same archetypal core, but are drawing somewhat different boundaries around it, and we approach it in sometimes parallel, sometimes divergent ways. I defined apocalypse as a transcendent evolutionary event, personal and or collective, seen through the fearful eyes of the ego. Edinger defines apocalypse in parallel terms. My essential answer is the apocalypse means the momentous event of the coming of the self into conscious realization. This is what the content of the apocalypse archetype presents: the shattering of the world as it has been, followed by its reconstitution. Edinger's language stays closer to the hierarchy of psychic functions. There must be an ego death for the self to regain ascendancy in the psyche. As Edinger puts it, considering an individual's experience of the archetype, the apocalypse bodes catastrophe only for the stubbornly rationalistic, secular ego that refuses to grant the existence of a greater psychic authority than itself. Since it cannot bend, it has to break. Thus, end-of-the-world dreams, invasion from outer space, nuclear bombs, do not necessarily presage psychic catastrophe for the dreamer, but may, if properly understood, refer to the coming into visibility of manifestations of the self, the nucleus of the psyche, and present the opportunity for an enlargement of personality. At certain points, Edinger makes statements that cause me to wish he had been better informed about the findings of near-death experience research. It's frustrating that a number of the aspects of encountering the singularity archetype which he interprets from a purely psychological point of view, also have empirical correlates that he never considers. For example, he writes, "We today are obliged to withdraw as many projections as possible, including projections onto an afterlife," in quotes. The apocalypse, of course, has also been projected onto historical events as well into a life hereafter. Near-death experience is not reducible to a projection, but Edinger seems to miss this aspect entirely. A far more famous Jungian who also misses the enormous significance of NDE research is James Hillman. In 1996, when Hillman was in Boulder on a book tour, I asked him why he writes so much about the soul but doesn't seem to consider available empirical evidence about the life cycle of the soul from NDE research and other transcendent states. Well known for his haughty arrogance, Hillman responded dismissively, "That's exactly the sort of question I expected when I came to Boulder." I wanted to slap him. Even more irritating was that the Boulderites present laughed at his apparent stereotyping of their hometown as though he had said something witty and incisive. I should have pointed out to Hillman that I had been in Boulder for a few months and was actually, like him, a New York Jew, confronting him in New York Jew, not Boulder style, about a huge deficiency in his work. Jung, who had a near-death experience and studied the paranormal from the earliest age, would never have fallen into such parochialism. Perhaps this is what Jung had in mind when he reportedly once said, "I'm glad I'm Jung and not a Jungian." In another egregious example of this sort of parochialism, Edinger writes, "Practically all the religions of the world have the notion of a final judgment, not necessarily coming in some future time, as in the book of Revelation, but coming just after death." The notion of a final judgment is not found solely in religions. It is also a universal element of the NDE, the life review. Though often a guide will say, "We're not judging you, this is just a learning opportunity," but it's still very much the equivalent element. For a psychoanalyst to write the above statement in 1998, when NDE research was already so widely available and remarked upon, is a serious, even ignorant error of omission. The following statement is a brilliant insight on Edinger's part, but it's frustrating that he doesn't recognize its extreme relevance to the NDE life review. "The coming of the self into visibility is accompanied by the ego's experience of being looked at, being stripped of all its disguises and seen for exactly what one is. This is not an easy experience to endure." And this could be part of the fear of death, is that a psyche may have been through that process before and doesn't want to be stripped of identity and go through the life review and so forth. In the way of a biblical apologist, Edinger sometimes goes to tortured lengths to adapt all the fevered imagery of the book of Revelation to fit his model. I find Edinger to be on much solider ground, however, when he discusses Revelation psychopathology as a classic example of what can happen when one is possessed by an archetype. For example, Edinger says the following about those who expect to be raptured. "Such a state of mind is a dehumanizing inflation that seeks permanent release from egohood and materiality. To embrace such a literal eschatological fantasy means, in effect, that the individual has already been raptured, literally seized. These people, therefore, have abandoned allegiance to the human enterprise and abdicated commitment to the historical process." In other words, when you become possessed by an archetype, you are seized by the unconscious and no longer have a fully human individual identity. Rapture and other apocalyptic variants are psychologically regressive forms of infantile escapism, a cheap ticket out of the human dilemma with zero integration of personal shadow projected onto the Antichrist and other boogeymen du jour. Of course, there is often a hook in the object of projection. There could indeed be an evil autocrat with horrible circumstances triggering the regression to apocalypticism. As Edinger points out, I think it is evident to perceptive people that the apocalypse archetype is now highly activated in the collective psyche, and is living itself out in human history. The archetypal dynamic has already started, is already moving among us, and in that respect, the fundamentalists are right in their preoccupation with this particular imagery. The trouble is they are approaching the phenomenon anachronistically with a psychology that was operative and appropriate 2,000 years ago, with concretistic metaphysical projections. Edinger continuing, we have here an illustration of a typical example of possession by the archetype of the apocalypse, and if one is possessed by that archetype, it inevitably leads to catastrophe because catastrophe is built into the archetypal pattern. The individual so possessed must make sure it happens in order to fulfill the archetype's structure. At one point, Edinger records a hint provided by Jung that if he had followed up on it, might have brought him to recognize that what he calls the apocalypse archetype might best be seen as a subset of the singularity archetype, which yes, relates to the ego and the self, but also relates to an evolutionary event horizon for the species. Edinger discusses some of Jung's writings about revelation. The sun-moon woman gives birth to a child. She is crying aloud with the pangs of childbirth. A huge red dragon with 7 heads stops in front of the woman so it can eat the child as soon as it is born. The child is taken straight up to God. Jung says the child is a uniting symbol. Since it is taken up to heaven, this would seem to indicate that the child figure will remain latent for an indefinite time and that its activity is reserved for the future. Jung's statement suggests that he is right at the edge of recognizing a collective evolutionary dimension to the symbolism. I had the same eerie feeling in 1978 when I read Jung's study of the Midwich cuckoos and von Franz's analysis of the 2 dreams in Chapter 1. As mentioned in Chapter 2, they came right up to the edge of the singularity archetype's event horizon, while leaving me room to plunge into its core. And just as my voice is failing, that is the end of the Apocalypse chapter.